Once Morgan was satisfied with her calculation, Belize was ushered to the circle's centre. He was an ancient druid who lived in the woods west of Caer Cadern, and, in Merlin's absence, had been persuaded to attend and invoke the god's blessings. He was a stooped, lice-ridden creature, draped in goatskin and rags, so dirty that it was impossible to tell where his rags began and his beard ended. Yet it was Belize, I had been told, who had taught Merlin many of his skills. The old man raised his staff to the watery sun, mumbled some prayers, then spat in a sunwise circle before succumbing to a terrible coughing fit. He stumbled to a chair at the edge of the circle, where he sat panting, as his companion, an old woman, almost indistinguishable in appearance from Belize himself, feebly rubbed his back. Bishop Bedwin said a prayer to the Christian god. Then the baby king was paraded around the outside of the stone circle. Mordred had been laid upon a war-shield and swathed in fur, and it was thus he was shown to all the warriors, chiefs, and princes, who, as the baby passed, dropped to their knees to pay him homage. A grown king would have walked about the circle, but 2 Dumnonian warriors carried Mordred, while behind the child, his long sword drawn, paced Owain, the king's champion. Mordred was carried against the sun, the only time in all a king's life when he would so go against the natural order. But the unlucky direction was deliberately chosen, to show that a king descended from the gods was above such petty rules as always going sunwise in a circle. Mordred was then laid in his shield upon the central stone, while gifts were brought to him. A child laid a loaf of bread before him as a symbol of his duty to feed his people. Then a second child brought him a scourge to show that he had to be a magistrate to his country, and afterwards a sword was laid at his feet to symbolize his role as a defender of Dumnonia. Mordred screamed throughout, and kicked so lustily that he almost tipped himself out of his shield. His kicking bared his maimed foot, and that I thought had to be a bad omen. But the celebrants ignored the clubbed limb, as the great men of the kingdom approached one by one and added their own gifts. They brought gold and silver, precious stones, coins, jet and amber. Arthur gave the child a golden statue of a hawk, a present that made the onlookers gasp with its beauty. But Agricola brought the most valuable gift of all. He laid the royal war gear of King Gorfithid of Powys at the baby's feet. Arthur had captured the gold-trimmed armour after rousting Gorfithid from his encampment, and had in turn presented the armour to King Tudric, who now, through his warlord, gave the treasure back to Dumnonia. The fretful baby was at last lifted from the stone and given to his new nurse, a slave of Owain's household. Now came Owain's moment. Every other great man had come cloaked and furred against the day's cold, but Owain strode forward dressed in nothing but his trews and boots. His tattooed chest and arms were as bare as the drawn sword that, with due ceremony, he laid flat upon the royal stone. Then, deliberately, and with scorn on his face, he walked around the outer circle and spat towards all present. It was a challenge. If any man there deemed that Mordred should not be king, then all he needed to do was step forward and pluck the naked sword from the stone. Then he must fight Owain. Owain strutted, sneered, and invited a challenge, but no one moved. Only when Owain had made 2 full circuits did he go back to the stone and pick up the sword. Upon which everyone cheered, for Dumnonia had a king again. The warriors who ringed the ramparts beat their spear-staffs against their shields. One last ritual was needed. Bishop Bedwin had tried to forbid it, but the council had overridden him. Arthur, I noticed, walked away, but everyone else, Even Bishop Bedwin stayed, as a captive was led, naked and frightened, to the royal stone. It was Wilenka, the Saxon lad I had captured. I doubt he knew what was happening, but he must have feared the worst. Morgan tried to rouse Belize, but the old druid was too weak to do his part, so Morgan herself walked up to the shivering Wilenka. The Saxon was unbound and could have tried to run, though the gods know there could have been no escape through the armed crowd that circled him. But in the event, he stood quite still as Morgan approached him. Maybe the sight of her gold mask and limping walk froze him, and he did not move until she had dipped her maimed and gloved left hand in a dish, and then, after a moment's deliberation, touched him high on his belly. At that touch, Wilenka jumped in alarm, but then went still again. Morgan had dipped her hand into a dish of newly drawn goat's blood that now made its wet red mark on Wilenka's thin, pale belly. Morgan walked away. The crowd was very still, silent and apprehensive, for this was an awesome moment of truth. The gods were about to speak to Dumnonia. Owain entered the circle. He had discarded his sword and was instead carrying his black-shafted war-spear. He kept his eyes on the frightened Saxon lad, who seemed to be praying to his own gods, but they had no power at Caer Cadern. Owain moved slowly. He took his eyes off Wilenka's gaze for only a second, just the time he needed to place the tip of his spear directly over the marked spot on the Saxon's belly. Then he looked again into the captive's eyes. Both men were still. There were tears in Wilenka's eyes, and he gave a tiny shake of his head in a mute appeal for mercy. But Owain ignored the plea. He waited until Wilenka was still again. The spear tip rested on the blood mark, and neither man moved. The wind stirred their hair and lifted the damp cloaks of the spectators. Owain thrust. He gave one hard-muscled lunge that drove the spear deep into Wilenka's body, and then wrenched the blade free and ran backwards to leave the bleeding Saxon alone in the royal circle. Wilenka screamed. The wound was a terrible one, deliberately inflicted to give a slow, pain-crazed death. But from the dying man's death throes, a trained augurer like Belize or Morgan could tell the kingdom's future. Belize, stirred from his torpor, watched as the Saxon staggered with one hand clutched to his belly and his body bent over against the awful pain. Nimue leaned eagerly forward, for this was the first time she had witnessed the most powerful of all divinations, and she wanted to learn its secrets. I confess I grimaced, not for the horror of the ceremony, but because I had liked Wilenka, and seen in his broad, blue-eyed face an idea of what I myself probably looked like. Yet I consoled myself with the knowledge that his sacrifice meant he would be offered a warrior's place in the other world, where one day he and I would meet again. Wilenka's screaming had subsided into a desperate panting. His face had gone yellow, he was shaking, but somehow he kept his feet as he tottered towards the east. He reached the circle of stones, and for a second it seemed he must collapse. Then a spasm of pain made him arch his back, then snap forward again. He whirled in a wild circle, spattering blood, and took a few steps to the north, and then, at last, he fell. He was jerking in agony, and each spasm meant something to Belize and Morgan. Morgan scuttled forward to watch him more closely as he twisted, shivered, and twitched. For a few seconds his legs shuddered, then his bowels broke, his head went back, and a choking rattle sounded in his throat. A great wash of blood spilt almost to Morgan's feet as the Saxon died. Something in Morgan's stance told us that the augury was bad, and her sour mood spread to the crowd who waited for the dreaded pronouncement. Morgan went back to stoop beside Belize, who gave a raucous, irreverent cackle. Nimue had gone to inspect the blood trail, and then the body, and afterwards she joined Morgan and Belize as the crowd waited. And waited. Morgan at last went back to the body. She addressed her words to Owain, the king's champion, who stood beside the baby king, but everyone in the crowd leaned forward to hear her speak. "King Mordred," she said, "will have a long life. He will be a leader of battle, and he will know victory." A sigh went through the crowd. The augury could be translated as favourable, though I think everyone knew how much had been left unsaid, and a few present could remember Uther's acclamation when the dying man's blood trail and agonized twitches had truthfully predicted a reign of glory. Still, even without glory, there was some hope in the augury of Walenka's death. That death ended Mordred's acclamation. Poor Norwenna, buried beneath Innis Widrin's holy thorn, would have done it all so differently. Yet even if 1,000 bishops and a myriad of saints had gathered to pray Mordred onto his throne, the auguries would still have been the same. For Mordred, our king was crippled, and neither druid nor bishop could ever change that. Tristan of Kurnow arrived that afternoon. We were in the great hall at Mordred's feast, an event remarkable for its lack of cheer, but Tristan's arrival made it even less cheerful. No one even noticed his arrival until he drew near to the big central fire, and the flames glinted off his leather breastplate and iron helmet. The prince was known as a friend of Dumnonia, and Bishop Bedwin greeted him as such, but Tristan's only response was to draw his sword. The gesture commanded instant attention, for no man was supposed to carry a weapon into a feasting hall, let alone a hall that celebrated a king's acclamation. Some men in the hall were drunk, but even they went silent as they gazed at the young, dark-haired prince. Bedwin tried to ignore the drawn sword. "You came for the acclamation, Lord Prince. Doubtless you were delayed. Travel is so difficult in winter. Come, a seat here, next to Agricola of Gwent. There's venison." "I come with a quarrel," Tristan said loudly. He had left his 6 guards just outside the hall door, where a cold sleet was spitting across the hilltop. The guards were grim men in wet armour and dripping cloaks, whose shields were the right way up, and whose war spears were whetted bright. "A quarrel?" Bedwin said, as though the very thought was remarkable. "Not on this auspicious day, surely not." Some of the warriors in the hall growled challenges. They were drunk enough to enjoy a quarrel, but Tristan ignored them. "Who speaks for Dumnonia?" he demanded. There was a moment's hesitation. Owain, Arthur, Geraint, and Bedwin all had authority, but none was preeminent. Prince Geraint, never a man to put himself forward, shrugged the question away. Owain stared balefully at Tristan, while Arthur respectfully deferred to Bedwin, who suggested, very diffidently, that as the kingdom's chief counsellor, he could speak as well as any man on behalf of King Mordred. "Then tell King Mordred," Tristan said, "that there will be blood between my country and his unless I receive justice." Bedwin looked alarmed, and his hands fluttered with calming motions as he tried to think what to say. Nothing suggested itself to him, and in the end it was Owain who responded. "Say what you have to say," he said flatly.